The last 100 years, without any exaggeration, can be called the era of US dominance. Military power, a developed economy, pop culture, the English language, key global trends. The influence of this country on the planet seems limitless. The United States accounts for only 4% of the world's population, but it generates about 20% of global GDP and is responsible for 40% of global military spending. And it seems that it is almost impossible to change this order of things.
The golden age of America begins right now. We will be the envy of every nation. I will very simply put America first.
But no empire lives forever. Ask the ancient Romans. They had a colossal army by the standards of that time, an efficient bureaucracy and grandiose plans. But all this did not save the empire. Or think of the British Empire with its colonies, rapidly growing industry, and absolute dominance of the sea. These powers seemed eternal, and yet they fell. Is it really America's turn now? The first warning signs are already visible. To understand when and why the United States turned off the winning course, let's go back 30 years ago. America is at the peak of its power. The George H.W. Bush administration is celebrating an ideological victory. The Soviet Union collapsed. The dollar is becoming the undisputed center of the global financial system, accounting for a staggering 71% of all international foreign exchange reserves. Capitalism and democracy, the foundation of American society, are spreading all over the world. Even Russia is changing the communist model to a democratic one. And then, the American recipes for success begin to be used by a country from which no one expected an economic miracle. Yes, it's about China. In the 90s, the Chinese economy grew at an impressive rate, more than 9% per year. Millions of people are being lifted out of poverty. At first, the Celestial Empire relies on the agricultural sector and production of the simplest goods. Then, the population moves en masse to the cities, rapidly growing factories, and factories need workers. China is starting to produce literally everything from electronics to bed linen, cheap, fast, and in huge volumes. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. The then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, considered this another victory for American ideology. Another country recognized the advantages of a market economy, an authoritarian system. Over time, Washington reasoned China would come to democracy, like many before it. Therefore, Beijing was allowed to increase exports to the United States from $100 billion to $1.5 trillion in just 15 years. The administration was confident that China's participation in global trade would strengthen America's global leadership. Meanwhile, China, gaining economic power, was preparing for a new role. The process was slow, but, as it turns out, inevitable. Forecasts are already saying that by 2028, China will displace the United States from its pedestal and become the largest economy in the world. How did Beijing manage it? Since 2010, the Chinese have invested trillions of dollars in infrastructure projects in developing countries around the world. In fact, they were playing on a platform familiar to Washington, but they were acting more subtly and cautiously. The United States itself has become preoccupied with creating new strategic alliances. Internal problems are on the agenda. The rapidly growing national debt and huge payments on it have become a major headache for the White House. Add to this the fact that after COVID-19 and a series of major armed conflicts in different regions of the world became disillusioned with globalization, which America has always relied on. And now, the stage belongs to Donald Trump, with his tariffs and trademark unpredictability. No one is sure anymore what rules the United States will play by tomorrow, and the whole world with them. The credibility that America has enjoyed for decades is rapidly declining. And it's not just about Trump. American leaders have been ignoring the cracks in the foundation of their greatness for years, and by the time they noticed, it was too late. Let's return to China and its impact on the American economy. From 1990 to 2020, China increased its industrial output by more than 50 times, to almost $5 trillion. And what are we seeing today? The vast majority of goods that are bought in the United States are made in China. These are 97% of laptops, 78% of smartphones, 80% of sports equipment, 83% of toys. The list can go on for a long time. At first glance, For the average American consumer, there are solid advantages here: low prices and a huge variety. What's the catch? The reason is that Americans are so used to this abundance that they are buying more and more cheap Chinese product, driving themselves into a debt trap. Look at the numbers. In the early 2000s, US consumer debt was around $2 trillion. By 2020, it has exceeded $6 trillion. Never have so many Americans lived paycheck to paycheck, relying almost exclusively on credit cards. The federal budget situation is no better. Today, about $1 in $6 of expenses is spent on servicing the national debt. By the way, in 2024, it reached $36 trillion and continues to grow. In 10 years, the forecast is $54 trillion. That is, each citizen will have about $150,000 of debt obligations. Colossal amounts. As a result, the country is teetering on the brink of crisis. This is not a problem that can be solved by tariffs or duties. This is a classic symptom of an empire entering a phase of decline. Each power has its own path, but the trajectory of the great empires is almost the same. First, rapid economic growth, industrial boom, expansion of exports, and improvement of living standards. The first stage. Next, the empire strengthens its international presence through trade, diplomacy, and strategic investments. The second stage. Having gained power, it reshapes the world order and occupies a central place in it. The third stage. China today is just between the second and third stages. Then, after a period of stability and prosperity, a recession follows, a step from which no one has yet left. Let's take a look at the Dutch Empire. In the 17th century, it was a formidable maritime and trading power with colonies and trading posts all over the world. Few people could compete with them in the field of finance. Holland was rushing forward, and this required money, and the government borrowed more and more without thinking about paying it back. The result, by the end of the 18th century, the country was hooked on cheap imports, accumulated debts, and could not cope with an inflated government and a growing social divide. That's what ruined the empire. As it is easy to see, similar signs are now appearing in the United States. But back to China. How do their methods of achieving global influence differ from the American ones? Beijing has a clear strategy. Invest today to dominate tomorrow. The Chinese are not inclined to mass consumption, like, say, Americans or Europeans. In the United States, about 70% of GDP is spent on consumption, while in China it is only 39%. For comparison, in Russia this figure is about 69%. The Chinese population prefers to save rather than spend. By the end of 2023, household savings in China have reached a record $19 trillion, which is about $57,000 per person. As a result, the Chinese government has a huge cash reserve at its disposal, which it uses for long-term investments, high-speed railways, the development of green energy, the support of modern industries. And all this is not only within the country. In the 2010s, China took a key step towards a new world order. It began implementing the One Belt, One Road project. What is it? A global infrastructure initiative that aims to simplify trade between Asia, Europe, and Africa. It covers more than 150 countries and affects 75% of the world's population. Over the past 10 years, China has invested almost $1.5 trillion in the construction of ports, railways, and power plants in developing countries. Special attention is being paid to Africa, and this is a strategically sound decision. By 2050, Africa will account for 25% of the world's population. That is why the United States continues to struggle fiercely for influence in this region, but without much success, China has moved far ahead. Let's compare the numbers. Over the past decade, China has built 12,000 kilometers of roads, more than 20 seaports, and 80 power plants in developing countries. And now, let's look at the United States. And not even in 10, but in 30 years, only about 800 kilometers of roads. Instead, America is much more actively involved in foreign military conflicts. And here we see the main difference between the two superpowers. Since the beginning of the 21st century, the United States has intervened in more than 70 armed conflicts outside its territory. The most famous example is Iraq. It is estimated that 10 years of military campaign cost America more than $2 trillion. At the same time, no tangible result was achieved. Exporting democracy and capitalism through force proved to be too costly and ineffective. China, unlike the United States, does not impose its own political system on other countries. All they need is to increase their influence through economic cooperation and partnership. They don't care what the other country's ideology, political structure, or cultural values are. If cooperation is beneficial, China makes contact. It seems that it's the Chinese model that is now defeating the American one. This is clearly seen in the example of Africa. In 2023, China's approval rate on the continent exceeded that of the United States for the first time. The American government simply cannot keep up with the Chinese system, which operates smoothly and efficiently. But in order to push the United States off its pedestal, it takes more than just a heavyweight opponent. The central problem that has been undermining the American economy for several years is deindustrialization. Look at the numbers. In the 1960s, about 30% of employed Americans worked in manufacturing. Today, less than 8%. Why is there such a collapse? It all comes down to cheap goods from China and other countries. Why would local companies compete at a loss? For example, take the southern United States, where the textile cluster used to be concentrated. Most factories have moved production to Asia, closer to cheap labor. Or let's recall industrial giants like Pittsburgh and Youngstown. Steel was once poured here and propelled the country's economy. But after the markets opened, production was simplified by moving to other continents. As a result, the sector that provided millions of Americans with stable and well-paying jobs was effectively destroyed, and the United States is now critically dependent on China, where they do literally everything for the American market, from iPhones to trendy leggings for morning runs. You might object, wait, has the US economy been growing at a rapid pace all this time? Right. But GDP growth is just numbers. Yes, according to them, the average American is richer today than he was 40 years ago. But has he improved his life? Think of a typical worker in the 1980s. He works at a factory, gets a good salary, is confident in his job, and can make plans for years to come. Then the economy turns to technology and investment. What happens to this worker when the workshop is moved to, say, Bangladesh? Technically, incomes have increased, but they have increased for those who are already at the top. The share of earnings attributable to the middle and low classes, on the contrary, decreased. The statistics speak for themselves. Today, the richest 1% of Americans own 30% of the country's total wealth. In the early 2000s, it was 22%. Over the same 2 decades, the average income of the poor has hardly changed and remains about $28,000 per year, while the proportion of people living below the poverty line has increased from 25% to 30%. The American dream, the idea that any hardworking person is bound to succeed, is bursting at the seams. The gap between rich and poor is growing. It is becoming increasingly difficult to rise from the lower or even middle class. Add to this the explosive rise in housing prices. A house that cost $60,000 in the 1980s is now pulling in at least $400,000. And the incomes of those in need have barely grown. What does this picture lead to? To the disappointment of his own state. The average American sees that the old path to success has disappeared, and work no longer guarantees results. These sentiments peaked in the 2024 presidential election. Why did Trump win? Because he promised to return the golden age to America, limit the flow of imported goods, and resurrect the domestic industry. So, how is Donald Trump going to prevent the fall of American leadership? First of all, the tariffs. The idea is simple. We impose import duties. Companies, faced with rising costs, return production to the United States. Everyone benefits. In addition, over the next 10 years, the federal budget should receive almost $2 trillion, which will help reduce the national debt. It sounded logical on paper, but the plan failed. 10 days after the loud announcement of tariff rates for different countries, the Trump team backed down. Why? Because for 100 years, the the United States stood at the center of the global economic system based on free trade. And when this center decided to sharply raise tariffs, the markets became nervous. The loss of investor confidence threatened a massive sell-off of US Treasury bonds. Interest rates would skyrocket, and the federal government would have to service a $36 trillion debt on even more difficult terms. Then there's the budget deficit and the new financial crisis. It seems that the Trump campaign understood this, but still took the risk. There were no other options, and this is another alarming signal. The American empire is entering a phase of decline. Think of Rome, which imposed chaotic taxes and seized citizens' property before sunset. Or Britain, which abolished the gold standard and effectively isolated itself after World War II. While the United States is trying to get rid of the severity of previous mistakes, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, China is methodically implementing a long-term plan. Investments and a guideline for the future are their course. It seems that the age of China is no longer a possibility, but an inevitability.